panel is going to be focusing, as you can see.
The mic's a bit low.
There it is. Okay, so the next panel is going to be focusing, as you can see, from Nicole on Sudan. Very, very honored and delighted to welcome four deeply experienced experts on the ongoing crisis in Sudan. And let me introduce them in no particular order. Quscondy Abdulshafi was on our last panel as well, and so we've introduced Quscondy, and so welcome back. Who's a senior regional advisor for Freedom House. I'm delighted also to welcome Niemat Ahmadi. She is the founder and president of Darfur Women Action Group, with a long track record working with non-governmental organizations in various fields of emergency development and policy advocacy. Before founding the Darfur Women Action Group, she worked as the director of global partnerships for United to End Genocide and Save the Darfur Coalition in the US and Oxford and Great Britain. In 2008, she was recognized by President George Bush as one of 8 global human rights fighters of the year. Welcome. It's delighted to have you with us. Our dear friend Nicole Widdersheim is back in a new capacity, but the same Nicole. She is now Deputy Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. She recently was the Senior Policy Advisor for the Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Prior to that, she was Director for African Affairs at the United States National Security Council, covering the Sudans and Central Africa. Before that, she was the Atrocity Prevention Focal Point and Senior Human Rights Advisor at USAID. She served as USAID Office of Transition Initiative Country Representative in Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Haiti, and she was with USAID in Sudan as a protection officer to combat violence against women and develop policy on genocide. Welcome back to your Frontiers of Prevention. And finally, Dan Sullivan joins us. He's the Director for Africa, Asia, and the Middle East at Refugees International, one of GMAP's really valued partner organizations where we've done wonderful work with them. And you should go to their website and check them out. Dan focuses on Myanmar, Sudan, South Sudan, and other areas affected by mass displacement. Prior to joining Refugees International, he worked for 5 years with United on Genocide, formerly Save Darfur, first as Senior Policy Analyst and then as Director of Policy and Government Relations, leading strategic planning, report writing, and development of policy recommendations on Myanmar, South Sudan, Syria, and the prevention of genocides and mass atrocities. Dan, welcome. It's so great to have you here. Well, we have a lot to talk about. I suppose the first thing for our audience is again the thing that for a lot of the Sudan experts goes without saying, but maybe it shouldn't go without saying. We are now 20 years out from Sudan, from the Darfur genocide in 2004, 2005. And we're back again with 2 years of brutal civil war, which has again been accompanied by genocidal violence, particularly by the descendants of the Janjaweed militia, who were the primary perpetrators of the 2005 genocide against various ethnic groups in Darfur, the rapid support forces. The Sudan armed forces have also committed massive atrocities and war crimes. Both quote-unquote sides in this armed conflict are in the process of committing massive atrocities against civilians. And speaking to in Dan's world, this is particularly urgent in the case of massive internal displacement within Sudan. The Zamzam refugee camp, just less than 10 miles outside of the city of Al Fasher in the Darfur region, is now experiencing not only mass atrocity war crimes, but also famine, or we think they're experiencing famine, but the website's down. So I just wanted to start us off by having a brief sort of factual assessment of just how bad things are at this present time. There have been a lot of developments just in the last 30 days or so. And in particular, if you can let us know about things that you are urgently concerned about that are concerning your work right now in terms of gender and sexual-based violence, in terms of the use of prohibited forms of arms, and in terms of the fragility or the vulnerability of displaced populations that you think we need to hear about before we go on to a deeper analysis of the possible levers for peacemaking in the region. Dan, I'd like to start with you, if you don't mind.
Sure, thank you. I guess, I would start with, Sudan, just looking by the numbers, is the largest displacement humanitarian crisis in the world. We talked about famine. There was determination of famine in 5 different areas. The last assessment that was possible at the end of last year hasn't been able to be updated, but we know that famine is growing. So the massive displacement, over 12 million people collectively, most of those internally, but more than 3.5 million that have been displaced to other countries. So over the last couple of years, I've had a chance to travel to a lot of the border areas in Egypt, in Chad, in South Sudan, and then into the Nuba Mountains in Sudan, and just see some of the effects of that. You hear the stories of what people are running away from, but I'm also very concerned about the lack of real refuge and pushback against people who are coming to other countries. So those are areas you can reach, right? So that's one immediate thing. And then the other thing that I'm sure we'll talk more about, but just to highlight, is the real effects of the aid cuts and the aid freezes. One of the bright spots in not so bright last couple of years for Sudan has been the mutual aid groups, the local groups like the emergency response rooms, and what they've been able to do. And they had been running over 1,400 communal kitchens, and since the time of the aid cuts, we talk about it, USAID has not done a great job of turning to localization, but they did provide a significant amount of funding to the ERRs and others. And so now that they've had to shut down some 70% of those kitchens. So there's that, to me, that's the immediate thing. There's a lot more in the dynamics that my colleagues can talk about more in terms of now with Sudanese armed forces taking over Khartoum and heading towards kind of a bifurcation of the country, what that means for negotiating access to aid, because both sides are also blocking aid. So those are kind of the things that I would start off by highlighting.
Thank you. Niemat, who would you like to join? And again, you know you're free. At some point very soon, we'll start talking to each other. So,
thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to our audience. I think it's really very important that we gather here to speak about atrocity prevention and specifically speaking about Sudan. I think Sudan is a case of atrocity that has been going on over the years. And over the years also it has been labeled in many different ways, and that's why it is not really defined in a way that is supposed to address the urgency and the importance of dealing with Sudan as a case of atrocity prevention rather than civil war or conflict, as sometimes they downplay it. The current situation, Sudan going through the worst humanitarian crisis of our lifetime. There hasn't been, in the recent history that we've seen, an entire country in a state of collapse. And the level of death and destruction cannot be described in words. The total country has been going through isolation, like since April 15th of 2023, when the war started in Khartoum, quickly spread across all regions, Darfur being one of the hard-hit places because of that history of genocide that was just mentioned. As of now, the entire region of Darfur, the region that is the size of France, is being controlled by the support forces, with the exception of Al-Fashir. Al-Fashir housed nearly 800,000 internally displaced people. These are people who have been displaced 20 plus years ago, and they live in a very difficult situation, and right now under attack. Al-Fashir been in under siege for more than a year now. They are preventing fuel, the rapid support forces, fuel from entering into the city, preventing food, preventing people escaping to go. And the level of attack is not just fighting between the two generals. And that's very sad to see the case of the situation in Sudan being labeled and talk about as a fight between two generals. It is a systemic atrocities that are being committed against civilians because the rapid support forces, when it started, they occupy people's home. They push people out, abducted women. God knows, we don't know the numbers now, but those women who have been abducted never return. But the escalated attack on women is reported every day. Famine was declared last year, and I remember this report from February 2024 when AMASIF reported that a child dies every 2 hours in Abu Shuk, in Zamzam camp, in a fashion. Zamzam right now become one of the hot area of the attack. There hasn't been access to humanitarian aid in Darfur, but we also have seen the attack across the country. There's no enough aid coming through Port Sudan, but also there's no aid coming through Chad or any other areas that we have talked about. The people in the very beginning, they relied on themselves. They relied on helping neighbors, helping neighbors, including those community kitchens. Locally led organizations have taken up the challenge of responding women, youth, and civil society group become frontline humanitarian worker. Is that enough? Is that adequate? No. People right now are so many people dying in silence because of also the warring party have deliberately cut communication means. They use it as a weapon of war, and the number of people killed have yet to be documented. We know that in Al Junaina, West Darfur, it's 15,000 people reported to have been killed. I think the numbers are way higher than that. The same attack that was perpetrated in Al Junaina, it has been perpetrated in multiple cities in Darfur. And I'm trying to be brief to describe the attack. When the rapid support forces come into the city, they make sure they isolate the city from all survival needs. They attack the market, they loot it, then they burn the remaining. They go to people's homes, they loot every valuables, and they burn the remain. They also target water sources. They target hospitals. They loot pharmacies, they loot hospitals, and then they destroy them. They use shelling to bomb indiscriminately, whether it is a hut, a shelter, or a building. They destroy, and they loot vehicles. So they take it as valuables, but they also prevent people from running away or taking those who are wounded to go to hospital. They also force people out of their homes. We have never seen in the recent history the act of exodus of people from their own homeland. And then documenting this and spreading it through the internet, saying that we now liberated Al Junaina from the Abid, which is the word slave in Arabic, that now we liberate it. Right now they replace the names that were existent in Al Junaina after 600,000 people fled from West Darfur to Chad. They now call them different names, and they're targeting also traditional leaders. So you can imagine on this now become like it's like a genocide and counter genocide. They went into if someone is fighting within the RSF or SAF is from a certain tribe, then they go into that tribe, even out of Darfur, like in Al Jazeera. And then at the same time, the Sudan Armed Forces using airstrike, bombing villages, markets, other infrastructure in like hospitals. And who is impacted are the civilians who are impacted. We've seen the case of attack on women. The recent incident in Al Jazeera last fall when 130 women marched into a river and they committed mass suicide because they felt they're abandoned to avoid rape because this incident has been going on systemically, but there is no way out. And this current crisis in Sudan, I think it has to be informed by the long-standing crisis in Darfur. The genocide that was committed before, no one was held accountable. Today, the difference is that the Rapid Support Forces, which was a Janjaweed militia 20 years ago, now they are more advanced, more developed, with more weapons, with more technology, but now they have international and regional allies. The United Arab Emirates have been the #1 supplier of weapon, money, equipments to the Rapid Support Forces, Russia. And then the Sudan Armed Forces they also have their own allies within the region, Iran, Turkey, Egypt. So I will stop here and will come back to elaborate more with the question. Thank you. Nicole.
We have one that you keep that one on. Thanks again to the organizers and Max and the whole team. Someone said in the last session that I really needed this, and I would definitely say I subscribe to that. It's really wonderful to be here with all of the different constituencies that still are dedicated to working on this issue. I think the most heartbreaking thing about Sudan and in our line of work for all of us that work on genocide prevention and early warning risk and also have studied this and been at it for a long time is the failure of all of that to see in our lifetime a second genocide happening in the same exact location with the same warning signs. The Biden administration and their waning days determined as officially for the US government that it was a genocide. And it's just, we really should be assessing like what happened. I mean, all of us have worked at in different places to build the tools, to build the risk. And at certain points, I thought that the US government had, really taken seriously the lessons of Srebrenica and Rwanda and like really invested deeply in an internal process to build that out. And then, so what happened? Why did that not catch or be able to prevent a second genocide within 20 years in the same exact location? I would definitely say for me watching the US government being in and out on African issues, it had the deepest bench and the most understanding and experience of an African nation. And inside the US government, many people have been engaged in the US, kind of led that space for Western nations for a long time. So that's something I hope we can explore and talk about and hear what people think didn't work. And I know my Sudanese friends think and talk a lot about that. The things that we're looking at right now in Human Rights Watch, and it's with with a coalition of lots of folks working on Sudan and trying to keep advocacy open and alive and current on Sudan is what Niemat was just saying, the devout and decades running long lack of accountability and impunity. We released, Human Rights Watch released a commemoration that this week was, on Monday was as this was mentioned, I think by you, or maybe Abdullah in the last panel, was the commemoration of 20 years ago, there was a referral of the Darfur genocide to the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is now under direct attack for seeking to look at all cases in Gaza and other places. And so that attack of the executive order that was released by the Trump administration, and also the coming days, there will be sanctions announced on the ICC staff. I think it was a 60-day period. It's in the executive order that is having a chilling effect on all the work that the ICC was doing on the people and victims of atrocities from Burma, from Ukraine, from Sudan. So this is, I mean, you have a country like many other places that has never seen any justice. And we know as scholars and students of genocide that when there is across the board blanket impunity, that means that the perpetrators are told you get away with it. So why not continue to use the same tactics? So this has been something that has plagued Sudan back when it was a full country of Sudan and South Sudan. It's part of the reason why we see South Sudan now having really high warning, red lights flashing, atrocity risk, because there's never been accountability in that place either. So we're trying to raise the specter of the ICC work right now on Sudan and say that is a referral that, frankly, an American Republican administration got behind 20 years ago. That work is well, it needs to pick up its pace, but it also shouldn't be part and fall victim to a new administration that's trying to close down the ICC's work for political purposes across the world. And also we're looking at a lot of the other main tools that all of us have studied that you're supposed to deploy for atrocity prevention and atrocity response that have been deployed on Sudan that have just not been enforced. There has been an arms embargo on Darfur also for the last 20 years. All the countries in the region are breaking it. UAE, as mentioned by Niemat, has been like robustly and openly breaking it. Turkey is involved, Saudi Arabia is involved, Egypt is involved. So in sending arms to the actors that are killing civilians on a mass scale. We're also looking to the lesson of that we know, and we know this all the way back to the Holocaust, that when you have a system and a bureaucracy that is committing atrocities and mass killing, until you affect and disrupt the resources and the money and the arms and the people and the ability to do that, you will not disrupt the killing. And so sanctions have been well-meaning and both by the UN and the EU and the US in Darfur, but it hasn't disrupted the flow of gold out to UAE and the flow of money back to these warring actors. And they have not felt any pinch in order to stop what they're doing. So we're looking at kind of these, I'm drawing it from things right now that we are actively trying to expose and record and document and advocate for that go back to the main tenets of atrocity prevention and how you disrupt and disable the perpetrators. And so we have these tools, and we're not going to let any movement or administration or government in the world to disrupt the fact that we are all students and we are committed to these tools. And this has been 75 years in the making, from the standing up of the Genocide Convention and all of the institutions, but they're not fully actuated right now. And I think the fact that we have a second genocide in Darfur is the emblematic and sad truth of that.
Yeah, thank you. I'm nice to be back here again. Yeah, I just want to kind of add on the question, what situation looks like and what are the kind of dynamics that we can forecast based on the current situation. In just a bit context to everyone who might be not familiar about the conflict in Sudan. Basically, in 2003 the war started, genocide war started in Darfur. The former former Sudan president, he used tribal-based Janjaweed, which is militia, as a counter-insurgency. And the training of these forces was on ethnic lines to target other non-Arab or native African tribes. And that is the fault line where the genocide happens. And down the road for many years, now these forces, in 2013 have been retrained as a support force, and they have now, not only having they get a legitimacy from the state and making some sort of legislation to give them some formal recognition. And when they are empowered enough, they open the business, work as some mercenaries with Saudi and UAE in the war in Yemen. They also work with UAE particularly on Libya, where they used to guard the Benghazi oil field and other minerals. And that is the time when we all know also the other aspect that when early, I think it was 2016, somewhere when Russia attacked some of the cities areas in Georgia, Russia was hit by a lot of sanctions, and it was very difficult for the economy. When Putin was preparing for a war in Ukraine, it was biggest effort is to de-dollarize the currency to avoid the sanction. And de-dollarization of the currency is done by having crude gold. And that crude gold was mostly come out of Sudan, Central Africa, and Libya, and RSF was key, and UAE was very good mediator in that process. And it's tons of the gold that went to the Russian economy through Wagner allows Russia to start new war in Ukraine without being afraid of the sanctions. Because yes, Russian currency can go down, but gold is gold. Gold price remains the same. And that's where, the regional and international dynamics around the new war that are not easily seen into the analysis of the conflict, especially when you're looking into the greater geopolitics, global geopolitics. What happens is when these forces are very much empowered and having this, after the revolution and regime change, they're, embodying it more and become more powerful than the state forces themselves. And I'm telling you this because you can find somebody, an RSF forces that are driving, a truck that has, a drone that its price is $150 million. They don't even know what to read, but how that coming, and that is the magnitude of involvement and support that these forces get with regard to this conflict, which make it very more complex for the local actors and everyone to be able to understand the dynamic. And as a result, the whole state system is paralyzed. And currently, when you're talking about genocide and mass killing in 2013, the forces that worked with the government and the frontier of personally committing those atrocities are the one who rule the state. My family is in the central Darfur, which is Aringi, and that is now the Republic of RSF. And I can't imagine how day-to-day looks like for anybody. You can't, you find a kid for, 12 years old, threatening and beating an old man just for a phone number or, having something that they wanted. It's absolutely difficult to imagine how that looks like. And it's the same that even with the war, how SAF is when it's eliminated in those areas, all they have only the Air Force, and the Air Force just come and drop bombs and kill, and indiscriminately killing, mostly the areas that are targeted are also not the RSF. Are just the same innocent people that are being by air by the government air forces and on the ground by the unit. So the dynamics looks that yes, there is some change for instance, the Khartoum South takeover, and also when we see the change happens because of the atrocity RSF committed. When the SAF take over, the SAF also now work with another counterinsurgency. Some of these counterinsurgencies are very Islamist extremists, and they also mostly promoting a rhetoric of secession, meaning Darfur is the problem. Now we don't want you guys. And whenever the power change happens, most of the people who are from Darfur or somehow they use this military rule to actually kill a lot of people, as it happens in the Jazeera and other states. And that is kind of putting up the picture of, if you're looking at what happens as the new state emerge, the South state from Sudan moving to Khartoum, the civic space looks very, very gloomy. Atrocities are also more likely to happen, especially in the high camps concentration where people from Darfur region exist. Is the more likely that in the coming months, the more they are empowered, that there can be also a type of atrocities that are different from what is being committed in the South, in the RSF group. Second, in the RSF side, the RSF is not questioned. They are training based on the tribal line. you go, the RSF go, and the owner of the tribal leader bring, 1,000 men, and he is a commander, and he is the one who receives the salary. And there's more. That's the fight happening. All of these groups also have internal grievances. And they, in 2013, we see that one of the mass atrocities, the second wave of atrocities was within this militia tribal lines. So it's very likely also, as much as the South advances, that those fault lines will come back again and change the dynamic of the violence in a different way. And I'm just to conclude, within this, what I'm seeing that, this conflict in Sudan has also its own regional dynamic, meaning that the war in Sudan is never been war in Sudan. War in Sudan always have, because Sudan is a transition region, all the way to Ethiopia, all the way up to Somalia, and all Sahel region. And they're all involved in the conflict, from Libya, Chad, Niger, Central Africa, all are part of this. So the repercussion of this conflict is that it can actually be decentralized. It's a whole large number of arms and men who are being trained, come for money, fight as mercenaries, are the future strategic threat to the security of the region. And I think that's like kind of some of the dynamics that are not visible at this moment. We just need a lot of kind of understanding, a lot of investment, which is currently actually doesn't exist either in the US or even at the African Union level.
Yeah, maybe if I can jump in, I'll pose a question to the panelists as well. But I think in trying to figure out a way forward and what outside people can do on this, there's a lot of comparisons to what happened 20 years ago, plus now with Save Darfur, and both Niemat and I work together at Save Darfur. But also looking at the differences today, and that's what Quscondy talked a little bit about. So I want to focus on two main things. I think the difference is at that time it was just Darfur, or mainly Darfur. Today it's hit Khartoum and it's spread, and there's the regional aspects. And then there's the external actors that Niemat and others have talked about a little bit. And there are a lot of different actors helping both sides, but the UAE really stands out for its direct and already documented, and by many others, supplying weapons to the RSF, which is responsible for genocide. So something that we at Refugees International with partners have tried to focus in on is educating people about that fact, pointing that out, and putting pressure on the UAE, which does care about its global reputation, puts a lot of money into it. And just to give a couple examples, what we've done is we have engaged with the NBA, which is UAE is a major sponsor. You'll see Emirates all over when the playoffs come up and preseason games held in Abu Dhabi. And the response we got was kind of just, well, we can't look at everything, and we feel like we're doing a lot of good by doing things. So, but not a satisfactory response. And so trying to focus on that, and on if there's different artists that are traveling to the UAE that they can speak out about this. And we have an unmarked website called Speak Out on Sudan, so not just Refugees International, for others working on this. And we did a short video that John Cheadle, the actor, narrated that gives kind of a 101 on the role of the UAE. So going back to the previous discussion, Abdullah, my colleague mentioned that trying to simplify and communicate, and then get into the more nuanced things. So that's just to give an example, some of the creative ways we're trying to figure things out. We've done rallies at the White House and in front of the White House, different things like that. But it's not to with this current environment, it's tough to get the numbers that we did, the gold standard of Save Darfur, and everyone talks about that. So just throwing that out there, and I want to hear from my colleagues who have been working on this for a number of years as well. What are some of the lessons from 20 years ago in Save Darfur, and the challenge? What can be recreated, or what in this new environment, new world, what can we do differently?
Thank you, Dan. I think the current situation in Sudan is the evolution of the long-standing genocide in Darfur. And we've seen this like internally, what are the factors, and also internationally and regionally, what are the factors and what we need to do in order for us to look for the way forward. First, the narrative. It's very important. Sometimes, like you look at the narrative, and it may be like a simple tweak, a grammatical tweak, but the consequences can be deadly. Because over the years, the international community has labeled the situation as a conflict. As like even after the determination of genocide in Darfur, many has been reluctant in defining the crisis as it is. Sudanese themselves, when Darfur was going through that, it was South Sudan before. But the majority of Sudanese were doing business as usual. If they stood up and challenged the government, prevented what was going on in Darfur, it would have been stopped. So that was one of the biggest. The reason people now, the current situation involved because the absence of the national identity, people resort to thrive. There is no national institution that are protective of everyone, absence of the rule of law within the Sudan. And also the divide and conquer policy of the government, that dividing people across tribal line, geographical, political, and especially being on the regions that are inhabited by the indigenous African have been systematically targeted. You look at Darfur, you look at South Sudan before, but also you look at South Kordofan and Blue Nile. So ethnicity has been the main aspect. And then looking into it is kind of it's about power, militarization, about money, because power has been always like when the attack were in South Sudan, they used religious, and then when it comes to Darfur, ethnicity was a base, and even right now, it is also the ethnic component is very visible, but it is the systemic attack of the powerful against the powerless, and they use the militarization, they use the money, and also the political support, like from either like national or regional or international allies. And this has, and also like we speaking about Save Darfur, I think that was the most successful movement. There's a lot of lessons to learn about because one thing that was really important to understand that people have mobilized behind Darfur from across the board, religious, human rights communities, celebrities, policymakers, members of Congress have championed the cause. People at the European Union, African Union was the first to deploy troops. So we had all the perfect aspect, but it's also the failure happened when there was no political will. People were criticizing the Save Darfur movement, and I am appalled to hear that criticism that was like, oh, there was like a high expectation. When there is a genocide, what your expectation would be? Ending the genocide. People have to be protected. Is that a high expectation? So the other way around is that it is okay for people to be killed and no one should care. Because it's like, oh, like you have to be careful when you mobilize people. People were thinking, people who mobilize here in the state or in Europe or in Africa, that that there will be an end to this. And oh, since that didn't happen, people get it. Of course. So the problem was the policymakers. The problem was lack of political will, and this is really important for us as a community of practice to understand and to understand it to ourselves, because the hope was high. We had UN resolutions, we had deployment, we had ICC referral. Never in history that the member state of the Security Council anonymously agreed without using a veto to refer a case. That happened. Those, of course, what happened has prevented many people from dying because there was also a flow of humanitarian aid. They pushed for access, But then the decline happened when the ICC has indicted al-Bashir, and Bashir has kicked the humanitarian out because they know very well to engage the international community. That has created isolation. In order for them to re-engage, to negotiate, then the international community has to negotiate aid, which was wrong. Like aid will not be negotiated. When there is a crisis, there's supposed to be an aid intervention, like humanitarian intervention. But what happened here in the United States was that most people who mobilized behind the Darfur movement were mostly from the progressive liberal community. We had a liberal government in office who never called the genocide in Darfur a genocide. Obama's special envoy said this is a remnant of genocide. That's dangerous. So that weak of the narrative that undermine the sense of urgency. And then we were not strong enough to criticize our son that we love, because I always say in our movement, you have to be able to criticize the person you love, not the person who disagrees with you. And we are very good sometimes in the human rights community to point finger to people that have different values than ours. But when someone from the house do something, we are skeptical, and that would destroy the movement because people were not able to criticize the Obama administration. So the change of narrative start, the funding start declining, and the international conversation around the situation start declining. So if we continue to approach other situations like the way we approach that for genocide prevention is not going to be a reality. It's going to be a theory, a rhetoric that we will be promoting, and many may have to take time off and go away because it doesn't work. But we have to challenge ourselves. And Sudan is the best case. If we can work in resolving. People also were thinking that Rwanda happened in 100 days. So maybe in 2-3 years that war will end. And that didn't happen. When our tools have become more sophisticated, then the perpetrators also become more sophisticated. They divide the international community against themselves. The same African Union that deployed troops against to protect people and called the situation in Darfur genocide, they rallied behind Bashir and attacked the ICC for indicting Bashir. So the change of policy, that also one of the aspects. And then the human rights community is managing the conflict versus resolving the conflict was an issue. Like most people are enough just to barely keep people alive, keeping people 20 years in camps. Why not send these people to their own villages and provide them protection and allow them to farm to be able to dignifyly survive versus surviving in this makeshift camp? And now again they are under attack. So our tools has to be changed in Sudan. Lack of accountability was one of the biggest in Sudan. If we had accountability, Al Burhan and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo would not dare to create the war that we are dealing with, but because of the impunity that was allowed. And there are certain aspects of this, why the situation in Sudan evolved the way we are seeing right now. In 2016, the European Union developed a policy it was the anti-African migration policy. And under that policy, they came back and they created collaboration with the Sudan, which is led by an indicted war criminal. But people from the human rights community did not criticize that enough. I think among many, sometimes us here and the Human Rights Watch and a few other people, but the majority of other people, yes, it was okay to be them. The money that was appropriated by the European Union, it was paid for the rapid support forces who are currently committing another genocide in Sudan to guard Sudan's borders and to stopping the African who are like this, are like Ethiopian, Eritrean, Somalian, and Sudanese themselves who are migrating to Libya to go to Europe. So that was, and then the Obama administration started negotiating normalization with Sudan. And how could you normalize with government that's led by a genocidaire? So that was also another aspect. And then the war in Yemen. Most of the weapons that was used in the war in Yemen ended up in Sudan right now. And that is where the friendship between the Rapid Support Forces and the United Arab Emirates started. And because of that, because the Biden administration was very quiet, because when you say the root cause of the current Rapid Support Forces war in Sudan is that, so these are all the factors that contributed to what we are currently dealing with. So understanding the issue, it helped resolve. And then there is a lack of framework. The way the international community approached the resolution to crisis in Sudan, they mostly talk to those with arms, political leaders, and handful individuals who most of them committed crimes. They will never want to resolve that crime in the first place. And approaching it with using traditional conflict resolution mechanism, where it's when the case is genocide or atrocity crimes, it cannot be resolved through traditional conflict resolution mechanism, which is bringing people to the table to negotiate and go and have a peace deal that can be implemented. Genocider cannot implement peace agreement. Their place is in court, not in the presidential palace. And that is what we do, doing the same thing, expecting different results. I don't want to say that is a form of what? We know that. That is exactly what has been the experiment of Sudan. We have been calling and saying, and I have confronted diplomats, policymakers, that this is not the right way. Even in South Sudan, I was like, you are engaging SPLM and you are engaging the government. What about the people? These people will go back. There is no trust among the communities. There is no accountability. And people will start fighting about someone took my land, someone took my place. Some people, because when they are displaced, they went into different areas. The same thing happened. And then now we see the result. And because of the fact that the core factor or the root causes of the problem is in Sudan, not in South Sudan. And I said this multiple times in multiple occasions that unless we resolve that in Sudan, South Sudan is not going to be stable, and we see that right now. So I will stop here, and we'll be happy to answer.
Thank you. That's very extremely helpful. I wanted to actually just take Dan's question and sharpen it a little bit and see and ask Nicole to respond. As I heard Dan's question, it was what are the significant differences between the remarkable differences between the conflict, the genocide itself in Darfur in 2005, and this one 20 years later. And one of the ones that I think immediately springs to mind is that for a lot of us in the atrocity prevention community, we've been deeply frustrated and in fact rather shocked by the invisibility of this genocide in Sudan. Just the lack of uptake by the international community as compared to 20 years ago. And this is interesting because it sort of runs in contradiction to a point that Terry tried to bring out in the last panel about a general learning curve about or curiosity anyway, about what genocides are, what mass atrocity crimes are, war crimes, crimes against humanity. And what you were talking about the last panel about the increased access to up-to-date information. But 2005, which a lot of our students, I think they were born, but they certainly won't remember, versus 2025. I mean, this is a huge catastrophe, hundreds of thousands of people's lives, and we're getting very, very, very little uptake on this. And so the question is, I guess, is why? And so I'd like to turn that over to Nicole. You can address that question or say anything you want. I just wanted to sharpen that question that I heard Dan ask.
So we a lot of us are spending a lot of time on questioning why, because we wanted to inform what we do now. And when I say we, it's like a lot of those organizations, both American and Sudanese diaspora, international organizations that work on this together as groups in DC and across the world. So, I mean, one of the big things for me was that you had different constituencies in the United States that had been involved in South Sudan for a long time, like the religious communities in the United States, the evangelical churches. You had humanitarian organizations that had been involved. You had a coalition of human rights organizations and justice. There was kind of this like perfect. You also had that the Sudanese had come to the United States. We had large diaspora communities. We're now starting to have second generation in Houston, and the South Sudanese Lost Boys had grown up and they were living in the United States and they were connected with churches. So you had this ability of a congressman in Central Florida who wasn't even sitting on a subcommittee for Africa, hearing from his voters that this country was having a genocide, and he didn't even know where Darfur was, but he came to Washington and he said, I'm hearing that from people in my voting district, and I should want to know more, and I want to know what State Department is doing about it. You had what was an entrepreneurial element inside DOD who saw satellite imagery and saw the villages burning and brought it through to the interagency and said, this isn't an area that we're looking at, but what is happening here? And you had the churches reaching out to the Bush administration. So you had this kind of, and then you had the freedom and the mobilization on the university campuses with the Save Darfur movement, some Hollywood actors getting involved. I mean, you had this perfect storm of a lot of energy and a lot of awareness and activity. So that is not existing right now. And I think this is because the United States is going through its own political turmoil, and we see a chilling effect across universities. I'm not saying that if someone went out and protested on Sudan in Colombia, they'd probably be okay, but it's, what's happening with the protesters for Gaza is just chilling, academic and student activism. I mean, I went to Kent State where we learned very much the deadly consequences for activism. And so everybody still is informed by the May 4th and the killing of the Vietnamese, those that were protesting and those that weren't protesting the Vietnam War. They just got caught in the crossfire on May 4th in 1970. So we have a country that doesn't learn about these things. But anyway, the chilling of the effect of having mobilization on campuses. I don't know what's happening there. I'd love to ask, students in the room if they feel like they're hearing about Sudan and, could a Save Darfur movement, something else, pick up again on university campuses. I'm very disconnected from that. And I saw that was such a powerful thing. But also too, like the flood of information. I mean, just listening to our Sudanese friends here explain how complicated all the actors, how big this crisis is, it can be overwhelming. And I think it is overwhelming for someone who's sitting anywhere or in the United States, and I know for congressional staff that I talk to daily, you're like, what do? We don't know what to do, and which node of this conflict do we attack? And I'm like, go after the ones you're most close with. I mean, we have an administration that's very close to these Gulf actors that are bad actors in this context, for example. So the overwhelmingness of it. And so I like where Dan was going and like what to do now. I think we all have someone in our family or ourselves that are NBA fans. We can talk to the NBA and let it be known that we don't like their deep corporate sponsorship with UAE, who is sending guns to the RSF, who are killing civilians nonstop for 2 years and all the way back to the Janjaweed, but certainly in the run up to this current war. We can still try to generate congressional interest from our voting district. With the aid cuts, Congress people tell me they're not hearing like they did before. Some of them that are still there, they're not hearing about Sudan mattering to their voters in their districts. We can also, none of us are going to fill the gap of 80% of money that was going into South Sudan and Sudan for assistance needs from the United States government, USAID, but the emergency response rooms have the ability to take donations. I've seen this with Gaza, I've seen this with other places. I mean, we can, and this was a thread that I want to pick up from the first panel, like when you feel powerless, just drill down to the local. Any one of us can help in very localized ways that still matter, that keep you connected and keep you living your own personal life, like Annie was talking about, and connecting. So there are things to do on this. Congress can do more. We are actually, as an organization, trying to get other states that hadn't been involved and weren't around in active, like Sweden and other places that weren't really active on Sudan to fill this gap that the U.S. I mean, a lot of these other countries would be like, well, that's, you know, France has the Sahel and the United States has Haiti and Sudan, and you take, well, I mean, these structures aren't working, and they're you know, like really paused or ended. So we need to look and put, I believe we need to put more pressure on the African Union as well. That may not come from an American citizen, but it has to come from our global leaders. And then connecting where you can make a difference locally is still something we can do. And then not losing the thread on what is happening and not being overwhelmed with information or crisis fatigue. This is another terminology that, you know, we hear a lot, whether it be for Gaza or Congo or Haiti or Sudan. It's like, oh, there's just so many crises that have been going on for so years. Well, then let's stop them. Like, if you're tired of hearing about this, let's be bold and do the political moves to help stop this. So that's the other thing. Another thread I wanted to pick up, that was mentioned on the first panel, was I wholeheartedly believe in, and still, like, even internally in my beloved internal, like, organization that I love very much right now, is stop with all the jargon. Simplify this. We saw an algorithm and a tech approach to ending various programs in USAID and state because they put gender in a machine and they kicked out all the programs that had gender in it. Well, that's sexual and gender-based violence. That means all the programs that were all the funding that was going from USAID to help women who've been raped in Eastern DRC have ended. I'm not saying sexual and gender-based violence didn't capture all the type of violence in there. I'm just saying that that's emblematic of how dangerous some of these elongated and words can be. It's also emblematic of the danger of technology when you use it to govern. But you know, inside Human Rights Watch, we've had a discussion about how even polarizing rights are. So let's talk about freedoms. I mean, nobody's free in Sudan. They're not free to move. They're not free to, like, feed themselves or just live. And so if rights is too polarizing of a term, then let's talk about just freedoms. Let's talk about the fact that this is rape, that this is the Sudanese armed forces right now are enacting revenge on collaborators with beheadings. I see people saying, well, they're doing revengeful violence. What is that? You know, let's be clear on what is the nature of what these things are happening. It's uncomfortable. It should make policymakers uncomfortable. It should make the states that are funding these actors uncomfortable. But I really agreed with that from the first panel, and I thought I wanted to emphasize it.
Thank you. We're about to pivot over to audience questions. I did want to touch on one additional topic, as though there weren't enough moving parts already. And that is that we are now 2 years exactly. It was, I remember very vividly sitting here, well, above us in this room, and in Frontiers of Prevention 2023 on Saturday afternoon, and everybody's who was working either with the federal government or in a Washington-based organization all reached for their cell phones at the same time. I'll never forget that.
Yeah,
moment.
when we started.
You were one
Yes,
of them, yeah.
it started.
And I thought to myself, well, this isn't good. You never want to see people like you all reaching for your cell phones at the same time. And sure enough, the brief window of possible democratic transition in Sudan after the ouster of Bashir was shut down, and it was shut down by two military men with extremely large egos and armies, a bad combination, yeah. And the plan, a transitional plan for merging those two armies together and integrating the RSF into the SAF went terribly awry. Now, if you fast forward two years to April of 2025, we've now managed somehow to exactly replicate this situation in South Sudan, where we have two egotistical former military commanders, the president here and his first vice president, Machar, who are now chest beating and acting for all the world like they would prefer a civil war to any form of mediation or accommodation or peace building. all the ingredients are there as AAPG puts it, the wood is dry and it's piled and the match is being lit. So if we can't prevent Darfur 2 from ever having taken place. There's too many people already dead. What can we do, or what can, and I wouldn't actually mind, because I was just watching Abdulshafi on TV last night talking about this. What levers, if any, are there for limiting the wood pile or keeping the match away from the same situation in South Sudan? Because I don't want tomorrow afternoon, I don't want this to become a thing where all hell breaks loose during frontiers of prevention. So I don't want you guys to be reaching for your cell phones tomorrow afternoon. What are the tools in the toolbox here if we move now from the Sudanese context to the South Sudanese context to try to minimize at least or prevent at best the same kind of dynamic from replicating itself just a few 100 kilometers south? And maybe I would even ask Abdulshafi if he wouldn't mind to sort of start us off on that.
I have a question.
An answer.
From you, right?
Answer to his question.
So I'm South Sudan.
You got this.
We'll try. Yeah, I think the transition, the South Sudanese transition, was always fairly fragile. When the two gentlemen, just like in Sudan's case, they haven't seen eye to eye. The first deputy president has been under arrest of some sort because he couldn't leave Juba. So now I think they've just decided to make the space where he will move instead of Juba now to his home where he's being arrested. The thing about South Sudan is, unlike many of these crises, the level of awareness, public awareness, is significantly higher. But what is really making it very difficult is there are a lot of people, whether in DC or elsewhere, that have invested tremendous amount of their political capital, their creativity, careers, and everything for this government to be formed away from Sudan, that now feel a little bit jaded. You walk into DC and you speak about South Sudan, everybody will roll their eyes, and for good reason. That really makes it very, very difficult. However, there are some little steps that are being taken. The region has shown interest. Not all of them good, because without the support of Uganda's president, this administration would have collapsed 2-3 times before. Because South Sudan, I think, has included Kenya as the largest trading partner for Sudan, for Uganda. All right. AU is also invested. I think the chair has sent the Council of the Elders to go and try and resolve. But the reality is, the two people who are involved in this what needs to be resolved. There is absolutely zero or even limited political will from the two gentlemen to resolve this, and all of them, make themselves the matter, Machar makes himself like, he is the main guy. But the problem that Machar faces now than ever before is he doesn't have the support from the region. Many countries, he was largely supported by Sudan, with Bashir and others now. Sudan is fighting for its survival. All to say that these local efforts that are being done, this regional effort, needs to be increased. But I think the United States can still play a significant role, whether we like it or not, to push, at the very minimum, freeze the conflict where it is. Because if it explodes, we already have 1.2 million refugees from South Sudan in Uganda. We will have more of them. We have South Sudanese in Sudan who are returning. We have Sudanese who are now leaving Sudan because of conflict. So it will create more crises in a region that is already bedeviled with incessant conflict, all the way from Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan. It will be very difficult.
Thank you very much. So I would like to have all of our panelists just have just a really short response to this, and then we'll start taking more questions. Yeah.
try to keep it brief. You go on South Sudan, but I think one of the key kind of differences between the comparison is that whereas there were two main parties in Sudan and multiple local militias supporting, in South Sudan, the risk is that there's not a civil war between two main parties because Machar doesn't have real control of the opposition. You're going to have a lot of fighting in all different areas. And then the last thing I'll say is it's very similar to Sudan, where the region and external actors are playing a huge role. Abdullah mentioned Uganda, UAE is involved as well. Here, traveled to the UAE in January. They need them with help with negotiating with the RSF. Very disturbingly, the UAE has established a field hospital near the border of Sudan. We saw that when they did that in Chad, they used it to supply weapons. We don't have proof yet that that's happening, but just seeing what had happened, it raises a lot of questions. So I think if you're going to address it, it's encouraging to see the region and diplomatically a lot of visits going on and efforts. So ramping that up, but also keeping an eye to the external actors and calling them out when they're playing a negative role.
To add to what Dan said, I think the steps taken by the regional actor is positive, but I do think they need to take more steps. Also understanding that stabilizing Sudan has a lot to do with stability in South Sudan, because it's kind of a proxy war. When South Sudan is allowed to be involved with the RSF, then South has mobilized, it is the opposition. So that is aspect that has been used for years. I think that need to end. And then also looking into this like a post-conflict situation where never like DDR in South Sudan has not been given. So the militias are still tribal. So those who are Dinka are loyal to Kiev, but then as of like, and then they made South Sudan look like they're Dinka and they were. But South Sudan has so many tribes, and those there is no institution that accommodative to the diversity of the South Sudanese people, and I think that need to be addressed in establishing like independent like institution. Also, rule of law need to be strengthened within South Sudan so that people learn how to go to court instead of picking up, because South Sudan has not been transformed at all. So I think we do need to see that in South Sudan, and then empowering civil society. Like it's very hard to find independent, strong civil society in South Sudan. Everyone has to be SPLM, and then if you're not, then you are a betrayal of those who fight for our freedom. So that needs to be changed by replacing gradually empowering like young people, women groups, civil society group, so that they can also work as a watchdog to hold the government accountable, also bridge the gap between the people and the government. Thank
you. I think one of the biggest problem for why these problems continue and why these commanders of warlords continue to fight is that they always, when external mediation comes, they spend days solving the wrong problem, or basically the false disagreement. Meaning two generals will have a real disagreement on something, but they will go and put in the table the wrong ones. And you will never reach an agreement unless you really diagnose what's real problem. And that's exactly what happens between Salva and Machar. Unlike in a few years ago where Machar has Sudan and has Southern Congo, Machar now is absolutely exposed. He's vulnerable. And that is why, the 25 years agreement of oil with the UAE and, Sullivan and changing some of the key governments and staff members, that is what Machar feeling that this is the way that they want to remove me. And that's why it is very difficult for Silva Kiir or his representatives to go to say, now we have this military team and we just don't want Machar, we want Machar face out. And because of that is why whatever problems they brought is a false problem. And all the mediation and negotiation doing is trying to solve the wrong problem.
This is the closer.
Oh, okay, sorry. Something else that is actually like, for instance, if you are looking for the Sudan and South Sudan problem, which we're seeing, why I believe that there is a lot of attention, and even within the U.S. compared in many years, you will see from 2018 after revolution until now, there's almost more than 3 bills passed, and there's still new additional bills. That doesn't happen anytime in the year. So policy-wise, there is movement. Even when the war started, the U.S. UN representative actually went to Chad. He did a lot of things. He worked a lot in the UN. It was just problem when you are in the Security Council and you can vote against ceasefire in Gaza, and then tell other people to stop warring. They were in a very critical position. That really make it very difficult for the U.S. to come in, even within the U.S. UN Security Council, as strong as it came in 2005. And that actually a bit really impacted in the role that the U.S. Even the U.S. mechanisms on Sudan that have been a bit struggling to be as effective as it was before. They are also still very much underfunded as it was before, and that's applied for the South Sudan.
Thank you. Who would like to jump in? Sela, please.
Thank you very much. I have 2 questions I'm interested to hear your perspectives on. One, I'm Kenyan, and Kenya has been playing a role in trying to advance mediation in the Sudan and the challenges surrounding it, you understand. So I would like some suggestions from you. What do you think a typical Kenyan, a citizen, could do to, have some positive contributions to the conflict in the Sudan? My second question is about the African Union. One of the panelists mentioned that the African Union could play a greater role in this. And I'm wondering what your thinking is, especially given that the chair of the African Union and the deputy are from countries that are more or less aligned with those you're calling bad actors. I don't know whether you see a greater role of the AU in this moving forward.
Yeah, I can jump on this. I think Kenya historically played most of the the key successful peace agreement on Sudan happens in Kenya. But unfortunately, the recent role, especially on Sudan and Kenya, it is just a lot around illicit business and money. And that really reduces the credibility of Kenyan government on key issues of peace and democratic transition in Sudan. And the UAE's key partner on that. A lot of money floating around with that, and that's become very challenging for Kenya to come very strong on that. AU in the past years have struggled a lot to just put agenda of Sudan in the AU meetings, because Mustafa is the chairman was Jadian, and basically what happens under the table before even any agenda come and show up. And that's why even AU become very ineffective. Before we have South Africa, Nigeria, like kind of counterbalance. Now the Sudan problem is like Ethiopia with RSF this side and Egypt with South this side, and everything in between doesn't work. And that's like really reduces the effectiveness of the African Union when it comes to their action and collective action and policy on Sudan. And is a very key issue, because always a strong African Union position, it makes easy for US, especially Roy on Sudan, or for the EU to be able to actually leverage internal mechanism to create a mechanism that actually knows and be able to work down to reach and any kind of agreement. And because of that, it's very difficult, and that's why most of these efforts are solving wrong problems.
Ashley, please go ahead.
Hi, this has been a very informative panel to someone like me who's still learning about the ongoing conflict in Sudan. So I just have a clarifying question from what I've written down. You were talking about getting rid of the resources that fund the atrocity and how a lot of that is not employed properly, or like things like arms embargoes aren't enforced. And so I had a question about sanctions that are being put on Sudan. And I was curious as the type of sanctions and then also the civilian impact of those sanctions, because a lot of the time and what I've been learning is that sanctions are not doing as much as they should to help the people, but instead are hurting them more. So I was curious as to your perspective on those sanctions and if they're actually doing what they're intended to be doing, or if they should be revised at all in any way.
Yeah, let me try to respond to that. So there was a huge regime, I will call it, of different types of sanctions that were on Sudan. And some of them went back to many decades because of the Bashir regime harboring bin Laden or harboring Hamas or other Carlos the Jackal. Like there was a lot of people, those that tried to commit assassination on the head of the Egyptian government, and also threatened George Bush Sr. at one point. So we have a long relationship as a country with this country, and so there were these big sanctions, and then also Sudan was sitting in the elite club with Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and I can't remember one other country as a state sponsor of terrorism because of this. So those big countrywide sanctioning tools of a different era, if you will, it did exist on Sudan, and they were very harmful to the people. No Sudanese person could have a U.S. dollar in a bank account, and so of course the elites and the government figured out how to work around those sanctions, and they didn't really suffer that much from it, but the Sudanese people did. Those were taken off in a process. I think Niemat alluded to it. It had, it's not without criticism, but a process of a tracked plan by the State Department that was started under Obama, and it was concluded under Trump 1. And I was in the National Security Council when we did this, and we looked at improvements in humanitarian assistance access. We looked at the U.S. was asking for different information and cooperation on counterterrorism. They also were asking the Bashir regime to stop buying weapons systems from North Korea. So there's a series of things that the Trump administration wanted to see in order to let them off of that big sanction that was really harmful. And we were also hearing from the Sudanese diaspora, had family there, so these sanctions are not hurting the people, the intended target. So, a lot of evolution has happened with sanctions regimes, and that they're now, and the US government does do a much better job at this, targeted sanctions. So right now, there is targeted sanctions to UAE gold companies. So when I was talking about how these sanctions are good tools, they're conceived in order to get at disrupting the resources. I'm talking about the fact that the US government did sanction UAE gold companies that have ties to the UAE government and that have direct ties to the RSF leadership, who are transferring this gold out of Sudan and sending it to the UAE, and monetizing, the mineral to have weapons and things come back. So, but UAE, who the Biden administration said is a treasured and valued defense partner, and received them in the White House, and that has continued under the Trump administration with the head of UAE's intelligence just in Washington a couple weeks ago in the White House. That strong U.S. government partner is not implementing U.S. sanctions on these gold companies. This is an easy one. This is one that we talk to members of the Congress on both sides of the aisle and say, this strong ally is basically giving you the middle finger on what you're asking them about a country that you've sunk $6 billion worth of humanitarian assistance in for 10 years. Like, why? What kind of partner is that? I mean, and that's just one thing, drilling down into one element. There are sanctions on individuals. There's sanctions on General Ahmadi and his brother. There's sanctions on other actors in Sudan. for doing crimes against humanity and human rights violations and ethnic cleansing, a lot of things that my organization, Human Rights Watch, has documented in addition to other organizations. So, and those get to them not being able to have accounts and seize their assets. A lot of these guys don't have assets in the United States, but also travel. We look as a government, we should talk to our allies in the region like Kenya and Uganda, and I think a lot about Uganda, and say enforce our sanctions because your banks do business with the United States, right? So there's a problem with having these tools and enforcement. And South Sudan, we have a huge UN peacekeeping mission that has one of the most robust protection of civilians mandate. What are they doing right now to mobilize to protect civilians as that country once again deteriorates into violence? I challenge the Trump administration, who's really, complaining and critiquing the UN endlessly right now. There are things that the UN should be doing that you could also be pressuring to do. Robustly fulfill the protection of civilians mandate in South Sudan, because we see all the red lights flashing. You can't just critique the UN on Israel. Like, if you're going to be a critiquer, have a full, robust approach to critiquing the UN. There are systems and things, tools that are already in place in South Sudan that could work to prevent if they get pressure and they get attention to do so.
Yeah, I think in terms of sanction, we advocated for these sanctions. And as Nicole mentioned, it's targeted sanctions. We also included travel ban and asset freezing. I think the sanctions are going to be effective if they involve asset freezing, because these generals have a huge amount of money sitting in many Western countries' banks. So if those assets are frozen and restored back to the Sudanese people, that will hold every single criminal accountable, because we realize that with criminal accountability alone, you cannot hold these actors accountable, because they would always buy loyalties when they have that huge amount of funding. It also enforcement, as Nicole mentioned, because UAE has helped the Bashir regime to evade sanctions and is still now doing that. So I think also there is a lot of education need to be made when sanctions are imposed, including the government imposing sanctions. They need to clarify that there are certain waivers for specific humanitarian aid. We have been hearing that, but right now also the impact of these sanctions that we advocated for are impacting our own work, because banks in the United States are flagging Sudan as a red flag, and you cannot transfer funds to Sudan, even to the neighboring countries. So I think we need to clarify that agencies operating on humanitarian aid need to be allowed to do so to reduce the impact of sanctions. But I think as a tool, it is important, but more education need to be, and then enforcement things.
Okay, let's sneak in one last question from
Thank you so much. I don't have a question, but I think I just wanted to add to maybe give my own observation from Abdullahi's question of saying Museveni's involvement, for example, in South Sudan had prevented actually the violence from being escalating. I would really differ a little bit, because what I always look at is what is the interest of the regional or the neighboring countries in the conflicts in South Sudan, and what role do they play differently in this context. I would really say that, first of all, yes, I agree that, to a lesser extent, Museveni's contributions and the other are the IGAD and also the East African community plus the African Union involvement in preventing probably the conflicts in South Sudan is for the better. But in other lenses, it is quite different, because I would say Museveni's involvement is more of an economic interest in South Sudan, because last year alone, you find that Uganda exports about 600 and exported about 600.11 million in terms of goods value in South Sudan. And compared to the other year that they also benefited about $536.4 million in only the trade that they have in South Sudan. So what would happen? It means that the more unstable the country is, it finds a better way to earn from this kind of conflicts. And now we have seen the recent wave of violence that just started last month in South Sudan. And now we've also read through the involvement of the UPDF forces in South Sudan, which is creating a lot of instability and insecurity around the country. It becomes difficult for the citizens themselves to even to enjoy the relative peace that we have witnessed in the past 4 years, probably 6 years from the signing of the peace agreement. We cannot go to farms because you cannot access other places. And the issue with the Kir and Machar's conflicts, I would say, yes, it's a political conflict, but it has got roots more into an ethnic line based and a protection of agencies and ideologies that they feel they have created for so far long. They need to be there to defend. And that is like creating a lot of inequalities and bringing issues in South Sudan. Growing in, like a typical example, my parents and grandparents were born in the war. I also grew up in the war until today I'm here, the country is still in conflicts. So it's quite difficult to see these things continuing to actually to prevail in these countries. And South Sudan and Sudan have got a good relations probably, but now again, the issues, the war in Sudan is becoming another challenge that you've seen what transpired again in February. I'm not so if I'm not mistaken, of the incidents that were committed by the SAF, and then the escalation of these issues on media and how it also led to a retaliation between the South Sudanese communities attacking the Sudanese communities in South Sudan and other parts. So there's a lot that also could see. Just a trend I want to pick up in the morning with the panel issues of social media and its incitements to violence. There's also a lot that we need to do around there. And lastly, I always feel so sad because yes, international communities, both within the region and maybe the global north, can come in. Yes, we need to dialogue. We need to have a peace agreement signed in place. But after signing the agreement, how do we ensure there is an effective flow of resources for the implementation of these strategies that are put in these agreements for these countries to be stable? What interest do they really have? Because now the peace agreement in South Sudan since 2018 has been signed. Yes, they supported the process of dialogue, but now I feel there's a lot of challenges with even implementation of some of these chapters. Now the country got this stuck. We're supposed to hold elections in December last year. It's been extended, and the transitional government of national unity has been complaining they don't have a lot of resources to implement some of these provisions in the agreement. So now, how do we ensure that these agreements are supported? And you will realize that so many of them that are signed, even not only in South Sudan, remain only on paper. It's not being implemented. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It sounds to me like these are a lot of conversations that have been overlapped. So we are at time. What is now time for your lunch outside? But first, before that, can you please join me in thanking our